We're going to talk about all those sounds the kids make, and I appreciate you all for sticking around. I will, not to generate more excitement out of fear, but it is going to be a horrible bronchiolitis season for any of those who read the Washington Post article that came out this week. So this talk, more than anything else, is meant to address the most common questions. How do you diagnose? How do you treat? What works and what doesn't work? And how do we differentiate between all the overlapping respiratory viral illnesses that we see in children? All right, so here are our learning objectives: to develop a structured assessment in differentiating between these three illnesses, implementing best practices, again, things that you can take home to where you work today and change the outcomes of kids you see for asthma in the emergency care setting. And I'm going to give some updates on the management of bronchiolitis, the illness we all hate if we see kids, and talk about the things that do work, talk about the things that don't work, and then how do you explain this to a family when you see a kid with bronchiolitis? But really, this is what we're trying to do, right? Same thing as our last talks. We want to standardize how we approach these kids, make the diagnosis. We want to do the same initial treatments every time. When we do our local education in Texas, I say, listen, a kid should get the same care in the first 60 minutes regardless. That's what we want for these illnesses. And the rest, in terms of where they go, depends on the severity of illness. And we want to talk about current best practice recommendations and how those recommendations influence our day-to-day practice. So let's start with the first question. All the following are signs of respiratory distress in children except. All right. Oh, good. All right, good. So only one of these is made up, and we're going to see examples of all of the rest of them. Inverted breathing is something I made up that sounded good. Which of the following is true? This is the most important slide in the whole talk. We're going to get 100. Which of the following is true about asthma treatment in children? Read thoroughly. Okay, great. We're going to talk about this. So, time to steroids is the number one thing that is going to influence the outcome of an asthmatic child who's presenting with the flare, regardless of where they show up. Given steroids within 60 minutes, if you treat 8 kids and you get steroids within 60 minutes, you'll prevent one admission. Reduces bounce back rates. And we're going to talk about ways to make steroids easier, less vomiting on your staff, make it cheaper, and make it better. I'm already excited. Which of the following should be part of routine management of bronchiolitis? Every time you see these kids, which should be a part of routine management? Okay, good spread. We're going to talk about suctioning. We're going to talk about the rest of the things that drive us mad that don't help, okay? And that's the real key to bronchiolitis. So why we all hate bronchiolitis, but we're going to talk about what we can do. So let's just look at our triage board real quick when you go to work on Monday, right? These are the cases that you will be presented with. A 5-year-old with upper respiratory symptoms and fever. The parents are noticing abdominal muscle breathing. They're straining. They're wheezing sound. They're having a continuous cough. It's worse at night. What do they have? Same kid, it looks like. Instead of a 5-year-old, now it's a 6-month-old. Instead of straining, they say, my kid is crackly and wet. Sounds like a washing machine in their chest. And they're having post-tussive vomiting. This is actually a different illness. Sure does feel the same. Different illness, different treatments, more frustrating. What about the case 3? This time it's a 3-year-old, but this kid's much happier, no fever. Woke up in distress at 2 a.m. Abdominal muscle breathing. I heard a barking sound, hard cough, and now they're better. They're in the ED or urgent care, freestanding, after hours. but they have a hoarse voice. It seems like their throat hurt. All three of those kids have different illnesses. All three of those feel the same. Most important part I could tell you about respiratory illness in kids, and most folks don't believe, the residents definitely don't believe me where I work, is you often don't need a stethoscope. The answer is in the history. I have forgotten my stethoscope at the beginning of shifts and still been able to get through because the answer is in the history. We're asking about things that can make those illnesses worse, and based on their age and their time of presentation, they are telling you what illness they have. And the hard question for us is assessing severity and making decisions about treatment. So young children who are premature, by de facto have more complications with acute bronchiolitis. So make sure you always capture that. You want to know what day of symptoms it is. What's the most common thing that a mom will tell you when they have a 4-month-old who's sick with cough and congestion? They've been coughing for 4 months of their life, right? And you have to differentiate it. But what you're really trying to figure out is, when did symptoms get worse? When did fever start? When did the new cough and wheezing start? You are trying to define where the peak of the illness is. We're going to talk about the normal course of bronchiolitis. That peak is between day 3 to day 5. Kids can get, many people here know this, but the average child who's in daycare or has a sibling gets how many respiratory illnesses, how many viral illnesses in a year? The average is between 6 to 10. So yes, they truly are sick their entire lives, okay? What about their quality of life? This is actually the hard part of medicine. It's not making the diagnosis. It's which kid is sick enough to go home, which kid do you have to do more for? And so when I really ask the history, I want to know, what is a kid's quality of life? And kids' quality of life comes down to eating, drinking, and sleeping. So are they having oral intake that's enough to make 2 wet diapers in 12 hours? How many ounces are they down? Yes, I know they're not eating normally. Your kid is not going to die of starvation in 2 days, but less than 1 wet diaper a day? Okay, that's worrisome. That's a kid who's dehydrated. What's their level of alertness or vigorousness to feed? And then what are some of the audible sounds that you hear, mom or dad, that are some red flags? But here's the real key. The real key is in the respiratory assessment. And this is how I approach kids in respiratory distress. I watch before I listen, then I listen before I listen, and then I listen. And I listen to all areas, anterior, posteriorly, as well as in the axilla. This kid in the top, you can clearly see here is having some intercostal retractions. The kid in the bottom, what's he doing? He didn't just run a marathon. He's tripoding, right? He's tripoding because he has asthma, and he's using his strap muscles to literally try to get the air out. I don't even have to listen to this kid. The triage note said he's wheezing. He's 5 years old. Get this kid a steroids. Let's talk about best practice treatment for asthma. But there are visual clues to respiratory distress that can be subtle. And I want you to go back to your practice and think about these when you see your next infant. If nothing else, it helps you to start creating this menu of how sick that kid is. Common ones, we're going to talk about nasal flaring, head bobbing, tachypnea, tripod positioning, retractions, and paradoxical breathing. But the only way to really do this is to look. So let's look at some examples. All right. So let's listen to this first kid. See if we can hear him. Tachypnic, intercostal retraction. So, do you see his nose? Look at his nose. Do you see the flaring? It's really subtle, but he's trying to get some forced PEEP to breathe. That's what he's doing, okay? So that kid has intercostal retractions. He was bobbing his head a little bit. He had a little bit of nasal flaring, okay? That is quantifying the distress about this kid. Look at the head, right? So this kid is trying to forcefully exhale and breathe out. He's an infant. So this kid's got bronchiolitis. I don't need a stethoscope. This kid has bronchiolitis. He's a young infant who's in distress, and here actually has some oxygen, okay? This kid's older. Look at this. He's tachypnic. And look at his exhalation. Look how long it is. Holds it, holds the exhalation. He has got an expiratory disease. He's trying to get air out of his body. This kid has an asthma exacerbation. Intercostal and subcostal retractions, okay?
Nah, he don't.
Kid's breathing in. You hear the sound worse when he breathes in. Breathes in. All right? That kid, pretty happy though. Pretty happy and vigorous. This kid has croup. Okay, that kid has croup. Worse during one of the phases of breathing, worse when he's agitated. If you went back and listened to the kid when he was sleeping and calm, the sound wouldn't be as prominent. Okay, it's upper airway obstruction that's worse as he gets more agitated. Okay, last kid, I think. Oh, there he is. Young infant, right? He's grunting. You hear that sound? That's the grunt. He's not just mad at the leads, he's actually grunting, creating forced PEEP. The ability to quantify all those things just helps you to be able not just to document, but when you're communicating about transferring a kid or deciding on whether kid, and more importantly, it lets you say, hey, you know what, that kid, when they came in, they were febrile, they were tachypnic and grunting, and now I fixed the fever, I suctioned the kid, and they're not doing it anymore. So that is your gauge to actually decide, is the kid better or not, and to make these decisions, which is the hard part of medicine. Let's get to the older kid. Okay, so let's talk about asthma first. So is it asthma or not? I'm going to talk about bread and butter cases here. We're not going to talk about the one-offs, but classic asthma is an older child, elementary school age, greater than 4, recurrent cough and wheezing. They have nighttime cough that's worse. We see this every year. You're going to see it this year. When you see an asthmatic get checked in to where you work, you have 3 main goals. I want you to always standardize their severity. How we treat them should not be based on whether or not I'm scared versus whether or not you think the kid is sick. It should be based on objective findings. We're going to talk about clinical scoring tools you could implement today. You're going to give steroids within the first 60 minutes, period. If you work in the emergency or acute care setting, those steroids reduce admission rates, reduce hospitalization rates, and actually take effect within an hour. And they make the biggest difference, even more than the albuterol. Teaching your staff that is the tough part. Kid can't breathe. The first thing you're gonna do is grab the breathing treatment. In fact, do both, right? But I get the steroids in the kids even before the mask comes on. And then standardizing dosing, making sure that your team is using the right doses for kids when they have asthma. Here's a quick snapshot of 3 of the most common asthma scores used worldwide. The PAS in the bottom right is what we use at our institution, the PRAM, which is used more commonly in Europe. But here's the good part. All of these scores are simple. They don't have more than 4 or 5 components. One of them doesn't even include a pulse ox because it's actually the degree of work or breathing that has been proven to correlate well with their FEV1 and how obstructed they are. Why do we use these clinical scoring tools? It allows us to communicate better with our staff. It allows you to objectively define if a kid's getting better or worse, not subjectively say, I think they're better. I don't know, maybe they're worse. You actually having a score has been proven to improve the accuracy of admissions and disposition decisions as well as reduce bounce backs. So implement one of these scores. Your staff will love it. And what we have done at many community institutions is after we teach the use of the score, is once we have taught folks that time to steroids is the most important thing to do, is we have taught staff that any kid who comes with a moderate to severe score, so depending on which score you use, the cutoff is different. For the PAS, that's anyone over a 3, that they can get their steroids as soon as they're triaged. So now you've educated every staff member how to objectively assess respiratory distress, assess asthma, and you can get the steroids in even faster. Here's an example algorithm where we use the score out in the community to then drive transfers and direct admissions. So in our community, when we taught how to use the asthma score, they standardized the dosing of albuterol, the dosing of steroids, the dosing of Atrovent, and if a community hospital calls our hospital and they say, I put the kid on the same asthma pathway, they came in at an asthma score of 8, after 2 hours, there's still a score of 5. We don't waste the family's time of going to our ER, excess of cost. The kid gets directly admitted and gets their care continued. Many local children's hospitals use these asthma pathways. These can be implemented at your own local facility and actually improve the care for those families. So I've said this 5 times. We're going to get 100% on this question at the end of this talk. Steroids less than 60 minutes change the outcomes. But what steroids do you write? Who here prefers prednisone? Not a hands. Who prefers dexamethasone? Oh, smart audience. There's not a right or wrong here, but I'm going to present you an argument as to why many of us should probably change over to dexamethasone. So I think somebody earlier talked about the fact that there's evidence in academics in the time it takes to clinical practice. The evidence between dexamethasone and prednisone was published in the mid-'80s, early '90s. It's now 2020, and we're kind of getting there now. Here's the main point. Oral steroids for asthma exacerbations are equivalent to IV and IM steroids. So even in a sick kid, if you can get the oral steroids in, you do not need to poke them, even when they look sick. I know it's scary, but get the oral steroids in and you are making as big of a difference as if you're trying to put that IV in and give them Solu-Medrol. But dexamethasone, 2 days of dexamethasone, so prescribed as a once-a-day dosing, 0.6 mg per kg day 1, 0.6 mg per kg day 2, is equivalent in the treatment of asthma as a 3 or 5 day course of prednisone. The cost of dexamethasone is 10 to 15 times cheaper than prednisone. It costs about $1.50 if you're uninsured. It's free sometimes if you're insured. And it actually has a less rate of vomiting. Okay, now listen, all steroids taste bad. So what are some tips? Number one, even in a little kid, I'd never write for the elixir of dexamethasone. I always write for tablets to be crushed in pudding or yogurt. The elixir tastes horrible. It has a high alcohol concentration and the kids will vomit. We mentioned that it's cheaper. This table is a table that we use in our community, and I mentioned to you that we have our nurses give steroids in triage based on their asthma score. Well, to make it even easier, dexamethasone comes in 4 milligram tablets. So they don't even have to think about the dosing. They just look at this chart and they find the kid's weight, and they're either given 1 tablet, 1.5 tablets, 2 tablets, 3 tablets, or 4 tablets based on their weight. Again, crushing it into something sweet, we use Serpalta, will make it easier and make it easier for your staff. So think about dexamethasone. Okay, steroids are important. What about the inhaled medications? Most common inhaled medication we're going to write for is albuterol. Most common thing that we see out in practice is folks that are scared to give higher doses of albuterol for asthmatic patients. I'm going to show you a sample table that we use nationally at US Acute Care where we see almost 1 million kids. Here's a take-home point. Yes, kids will get tachycardic when they have albuterol, but they will be fine. What you are trying to do for severe asthma exacerbation is maximize that beta agonist, maximize saturation to slowly improve their asthma exacerbation, okay? The key here is actually having the right doses, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Some folks ask, can I use MDI with spacer? My answer is yes, you can. It has been shown that the use of MDI with spacer is equivalent to continuous nebulizer, but do you have the staff to do it? Do you have the time to do it? And are you able to effectively basically hold a kid down sometimes to make sure that they're taking good breaths and they have breaks between MDIs? This is the challenge for most of us. But this is relevant when a kid gets better and you send them home. So I have had many asthmatic patients where I will have on continuous albuterol for a couple hours, and I will teach the family how to do an MDI with spacer for home, and I'll make sure they have the right dose of MDIs, and we'll talk about that. The most important thing, though, in assessing these children is once you've gotten the steroids in, is reassessing that kid within the first hour. Remember that albuterol is a fast-acting reversal agent. So it will wear off, and we use continuous albuterol again to maximize the beta agonist treatment. In the first hour, if it's not already a part of your routine care, any child that has more than a mild flare should be getting ipratropium, also known as Atrovent. If you use it in the first hour, we know, again, 1 out of 8, so for every 8 kids that you add Atrovent to, you will prevent 1 hospital admission. After the first hour, though, it hasn't been shown to be much benefit. So for some reason, it works really well in that acute phase when we're giving steroids and they're having a flare, but beyond that, there's not much benefit in sending people home with it or doing it as an inpatient. There's very simple dosing, so let's go to the dosing. Here's an example table of what we use. And so for a kid who's coming in with a flare that's moderate to severe, we make it really simple. If you're less than 20 kilos and you're there for a moderate to severe flare, we give you 10 milligrams of continuous albuterol for an hour. If you're greater than 20 kilos, we give you 15. If you're smaller, you can give between 6 to 8 puffs. Again, we talked about this. These are dosing for single dose nebs. I don't love single dose nebs, because, as we just mentioned, most people are underestimating the severity of the asthma flare. So if you use the standard asthma scoring tool and you have a kid with an asthma score of 1, okay, a single dose NEB may be actually all you need. It's very reasonable. But many people who are presenting in the emergency acute setting, in fact, are scoring higher than you appreciate, and that continuous albuterol is what they need. The Atrovent dosing is even simpler. You either give in a small dose, 250 mics or 500 mics. Okay. All right, when do I do more for asthma? Well, you're already going to do steroids. Hopefully I've convinced you that dexamethasone may be a part of your regular practice. You're going to do inhaled treatment with albuterol. You're going to add Atrovent. When do I use these other things? And the answer is not often, but you want to make sure you have a way to do them. Magnesium is probably the most common adjunct that is asked about, and here's the short of it. Does magnesium help for kids with severe exacerbation? After 20 years of research, the answer is, I don't know, okay? Because there's not great randomized controlled trials on this. However, in large meta-analysis studies, what has been shown is that if you have a kid who's really sick, so we use the PAS score, a kid who's scoring 9 or 10, if they are not getting better within the first 30 minutes, the greatest benefit for magnesium is going to be then. So adding magnesium after the kid's getting worse after 2 hours may have less benefit. So if you're going to do it early. If you're going to do it, make sure you give these kids tons of fluid boluses. Magnesium will dilate your blood vessels, right? We know this. You guys know this in treating adults, and it will make them hypotensive. Do the drip. We do 50 mg per kg, and I always say run it over 45 minutes, like a long time. Sometimes if a kid's blood pressure starts to go down, I say just make it over an hour. Okay, there's not a benefit in pushing it any faster than that. Other medications that you may want to have just in case things are really hitting the fan is IM medication, specifically epinephrine. This is for the kid who walks into your facility and is trying to die, and you are worried that you can't get any albuterol and they may not be moving anywhere, they may not be moving any air, they may be almost syncopizing from their lack of aeration. You can give epinephrine as an IM dose. Terbutaline, much less readily available, and in fact, I don't love terbutaline IV. Many children's hospitals have started to go away from it because at that point, there's not been a lot of proven benefit that it changes. So if you're going to have a secondary adjunct medications in your facility, I'd rather you have a protocol for MAG IV and be able to access epinephrine IM. The use of BiPAP is another common question to avoid the thing that we never want to do, right? Which is intubate an asthmatic patient. If you're comfortable using BiPAP in a kid, I would call your receiving facility, as giving positive pressure is a tricky thing to do in asthmatic where you're trying to get air out. But if it's trying to avoid the rare event of intubation, it may be needed. Okay, let's get into the thing that's taking over the country though, all right? So let's take that kid who was crackly and wheezy. That kid had bronchiolitis, right? So we finished asthma, the older kid, it's easy. I can do an asthma score, I'm giving steroids, I'm giving albuterol. It's so straightforward, it's almost simple. Then you take bronchiolitis, which is a hot mess of a disease, and every kid looks horrible and they sound horrible, and somehow you try to figure out who goes to the children's hospital and who can go home. So we're gonna talk about these big questions. His kid, classic bronchiolitis, retractions, wheezing, right? Vigorous. So what does he get? What does he need, right? Some people say steroids. Some people say albuterol. Is any of it going to help? Okay, let's get into the messy part of it. First things first, the money for treatment and deciding what to do is in the history. So bronchiolitis has 3 phases. There's day 1 to 3. Those are my favorite days. You got runny nose, you got congestion. Your nose is a faucet of snot, but the kid's pretty happy. You listen to the lungs, it doesn't sound too bad. You're gonna focus on suctioning. We're gonna talk about that in one of the resources we've given you. Day 3 is the day they show up to the urgent care emergency department after hours. That's when they start noticing the crackles. They notice the tachypnea. They notice those things. Day 5 may be still the peak of the illness, but now things are getting better, but the cough is still persistent. 75% of kids with bronchiolitis will still have a cough at 14 days, okay? So the average kid takes between 2 to 3 weeks to get rid of their cough. It's like living with a smoker, but they're small and cute, okay? You're going to look before you listen. And then the question we all hate, you just saw that kid. Everyone, I saw it all your faces. You all got worried. So what do we need to do? Like, do we do an x-ray? Do we do steroids? What do we do? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what your toolbox is, and then you can all hate me when I say that nothing works. Bronchiolitis is a purely clinical diagnosis. So who gets it? It's young infants, right? It's kids usually that are less than a year, but all the way up to 24 months. We talked about the time course. But your history is really important here. If a family says, I saw my kid turn blue, or the kid was having true apnea, doesn't matter how happy the kid looks, send him to the children's facility. That is a risk factor, okay? Prematurity is a risk factor, young age is a risk factor. These last three bullets, though, are not by themselves reasons to admit every kid, okay? And this is the tricky part. Who do you admit and who you don't? It's really based on their level of distress. Before we even get into bronchiolitis, I should mention this. As children's hospitals start to fill up across the country, and you all are truly the front line of facing this illness, when I've been doing education with all my community providers, I want to assure everyone this, bronchiolitis still is a low mortality disease. It's between about 0.5, no more than 1%. And it's in the kids who have the chronic comorbidities. So yes, they are sick, but if we do the right thing, you can manage them and you can do a good job. Kid on the left is day one. The kid in the middle just looks so cute, but coughing. That kid is in the peak of illness, and the kid on the right has retractions. So here are the questions that you're going to ask yourself. Do I do any of these things? Let's get into it. All right, this is where everyone gets mad at me. So, do I do viral testing? Here's my short answer. No. Okay? Doesn't matter. Is 80% of bronchiolitis caused by RSV? Yes. Do I care? No. We don't isolate in children's hospitals based on viral testing. The only two caveats now are, does it matter if the respiratory virus causing bronchiolitis is COVID? Maybe. We just talked about that a lot today. And does it matter if they have flu as the cause? Maybe. Because you may have to decide if you're going to give Tamiflu or not in the first 24 hours. But the actual virus that is causing bronchiolitis does not predict morbidity, okay? So having RSV or not does not predict what's going to happen with the bronchiolitis. What tells you what's happening with the bronchiolitis is the exam in front of you, okay? There's about 5 to 6 circulating viruses that are the big causes of bronchiolitis. RSV is number one. So your exam matters more than the test. What about x-rays? Do you do an x-ray on all these kids? This one I have mixed feelings about. I sit on a couple of quality panels, and one of the things I was asked was, should we track the rate of x-rays done for bronchiolitis in the community? And then I flipped the question around and I said, do you want to track how many EKGs I do in every grandparent that has chest pain in my children's hospital? Because I'm scared of grandparents. And I'm doing an EKG in all of them. I don't care if their toe hurts. I'm doing an EKG in all of them. So I don't like the idea of saying don't do x-ray, but I want to caution you in this. Every x-ray you do in bronchiolitis is going to be abnormal. And we know that doing excessive x-rays in bronchiolitis leads to overprescription of antibiotics, and it actually doesn't really gain much if you've already assessed their respiratory distress. If you've already assessed their respiratory distress and the kid is satting well and they're drinking well, the chest x-ray is probably not going to add much. So when do I do x-rays? The kid who's severely hypoxemic, less than 90%, stays at 90%, I can't explain it, do the x-ray. The kid who maybe doesn't look like bronchiolitis, they don't even have a fever, there's almost no snot coming out. I listen to them, they have a murmur. Could this kid have myocarditis? Is there something else on the list? And then the kid who looks really ill. So think about using those as your guides to doing chest x-ray. What about an IV? The kid needs an IV for sure, right? Actually, maybe not. This is where talking to your receiving hospital may be helpful. We're going to get into respiratory supportive care with high flow nasal cannula. But many children's hospitals have now gone to the fact that even if a kid is on high flow nasal cannula, even if they're getting respiratory support, that we don't automatically place IVs in them, because kids are amazing. They want to drink and they want to eat. If you can reduce their work of breathing, they often will still be able to maintain hydration. Some of us have even gone to OG and NG feeding protocols. So talk to your receiving facility. It may not be worth the stress of trying to place that IV. If the kid is in severe distress, apnea, just not moving air, yes, that kid probably does need an IV because they are at aspiration risk. But focus on your history and physical exam to guide that decision. How many wet diapers? Do they have tears when they're crying? What's their mental status like? Those three, if there are red flags there, I lean towards trying to get an IV in early. Okay, what about the wheezing? So we all heard these kids, they're wheezing like crazy. You want to make them better. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics comes out in 2014 and they say, stop doing everything. Albuterol doesn't help, steroids don't help, these things don't help. And everybody who worked on the front lines groaned together collectively, right? But why did they do this? When you look at bronchiolitis, it's actually a pyramid. About 60 to 70% of kids are going to be able to be managed at home. And that's what they were trying to make in that statement, is those kids, the kids who will be able to manage at home, if you give them albuterol and if you give steroids, you're not changing the course of the illness. It's true. Even if you give albuterol and you see short-term benefit, kid maybe looks more comfortable, long-lasting in terms of actually reducing the crackles and reducing the wheezes doesn't change. So I would caution against the empiric use of albuterol. Now, what they excluded when they made the statement was they excluded all ICU kids. So if you're transferring a kid to me and they are in distress and they need to go to the ICU, do not think twice. Just try it. At the very least, what it does for both of us is it defines whether or not the kid is going to be responsive or not. Where this really applies is in the young infant, okay? So I told you that bronchiolitis is 0 to 2 years, but kids kind of overlap, right? So the really, really young infant, when you give albuterol, probably is the least likely to respond. So just keep that in mind. If you have a routine practice of prescribing albuterol, I'd caution you against it. Consider a trial for the really, really sick kid. And explaining this to families, that's the hard part, right? Because when you hear wheezing, I just gave a talk for the first 20 minutes about how important dexamethasone was in asthma, and that's a wheezing disease. This is also a wheezing disease, but it's a different disease. It's an inflammatory disease that is really driven by mucus plugging and inflammation. And what we know, much like albuterol, is that giving steroids not only does not change the course, but even when you track those little baby infants that are 4 months old and have recurrent bronchiolitis and then go on to develop asthma when they're 5 or 6, if they got steroids when they were little babies, it still didn't change their course. So when do I pull the trigger and actually use steroids? It's when there's this overlap. So if it's a 4-month-old, I'm not giving steroids, it's not going to change anything. But if this kid walks in and they're 23 months old, and you really listen and you're like, man, this kid has wheezed every single time they get sick. That is that gray area, that transition between bronchiolitis and asthma. And I'm not here to tell you to not use it in those kids. I think it's a very gray area. But in the classic bread and butter bronchiolitis kid, less than a year, giving routine steroids is not going to change the course of illness. This is how you feel, right? This is how I feel when it's bronchiolitis season. This is what I want you to think about when you go back to work today, because it is going to be a busy bronchiolitis season. So step 1, how do you suction right now? This sounds so simple, but it is the most complicated thing in the world. Okay? Does every kid with bronchiolitis get suctioned where you work? If they do we do it the same way? Here's where the evidence supports. Use nasal saline when you're suctioning kids. If you're using the wall suction, there is no benefit in deep tracheal suctioning in these kids. But doing good nasal suctioning is good. And yes, the over-the-counter home products, like you see in the bottom right where the parents suck with their mouth, actually have been shown to provide great benefit, as well as the regular bulb. Use the opportunity to suction to teach the families about what they're going to do at home. So we do Teach Back in our ER. And in fact, one of your supplements is a handout about instructions on how to take care of bronchiolitis in both English and Spanish, focusing on this. And use those over-the-counter products. Okay, that's great. That's for the normal kid that's not that sick. But what about the kid who's in more distress? This is where you may want to go back to your home facility and say, hey, bronchiolitis is about to hit, or maybe it's already hit if you've come from the East Coast or even the Midwest. Do we have a protocol for high flow nasal cannula And do we have a protocol for oxygen? Who needs simple flow oxygen? Any kid that has persistent saturations less than 90% does deserve to have simple flow nasal cannula and an admission to the hospital. If you live at increased elevations like in Colorado, sometimes that cutoff is a little bit lower. High flow nasal cannula, which we're going to get into here in just a minute, has dramatically increased in utilization over the last decade. The good parts about it are that kids tolerate it really well. The kids look so much better. And it's actually relatively easy-ish to transfer a kid from a community to a children's facility on high flow nasal cannula if you have good transport systems. What are the cons? The latest evidence over the last couple years have shown that although we have increased the use of high flow nasal cannula in children's hospitals, we've actually not decreased ICU admissions. We've not decreased length of stay. So we still use it quite a bit. We're going to talk a little bit about it. CPAP and intubation. Again, going back to the low mortality complications, I would caution you in intubating the very, very tachypnic bronchiolitis kid just because you're scared of their tachypnea, okay? That kid's gonna tolerate being tachypnic in high flow way more than you sedating and paralyzing the kid and then sticking a tube in their mouth. That's when it becomes difficult to manage that child. But if a child is having frank apnea in front of you and they're apneic and they're unstable, there's nothing else that's gonna fix them other than intubation. Okay, so that's when I don't mess around with CPAP. I don't mess around with high flow nasal cannula. I suctioned them. The nurses called me twice and they said, listen, I've had to shake this kid twice. They stopped breathing. And I say, okay, let's get ready. We probably have to intubate this kid again. A relatively rare complication, but one you should keep in mind. So what's the deal with high flow nasal cannula? We talked about its increased use. I want to encourage all of you to go back to where you work and say, can we do this where I work right now? Because this is the thing that's going to save you when you got a sick bronchiolitis kids. High flow nasal cannula does two things. It delivers extra flow and extra FiO2 via warm humidified air through a nasal cannula. When we use it, you want to make sure you have a good setup. There are many products out there and companies that do it. I do not have any affiliation with any of them. Vapotherm is probably the most commonly one that's used here in the United States if you need one to go research. When you use it, you're not going to do it on every bronchiolitis patient. The goal is not to make the happy bronchiolitis get put on this because you've just bought them an admission, but the kid who's in distress, who you've suctioned, who we've looked at. Flow and FiO2 are two different things. So you adjust the FiO2 based on the SATs. Goal SATs is more than 90%. So you can have a kid on high flow nasal cannula and have them on room air, completely normal, very common. The flow is what increases their PEEP and increases their stenting and reduces worker breathing. A general rule of thumb is that you start between about 1 to 2 liters per kilo. Most kids are between about 3 to 5 kilos, so you're starting between about 6 to 8 liters. Talk to your receiving facility about what they do, because the max setting is just made up. Every children's hospital is different about when they max out, and you may want to, especially because right now children's hospitals are full, they may have you managing these kids in your own setting. Be very, very careful of the kid who's getting more tired and that's less interactive on high flow nasal cannula, because this is not something that helps with ventilation, and that kid may actually be getting more sick. Most of these kids just tend to be happier. They start to drink and they just look well. So here's a kid who's happy on high flow nasal cannula. This is kind of the setup that's next to their bed. One of these right here is set up to deliver the flow. This thing right here is what changes the FiO2. This is what changes the flow, okay? And so work with your respiratory therapist. CPAP is, if you work at a facility that has really good respiratory therapists and is able to fit CPAP or nasal CPAP or BiPAP is another option, it's more likely that you're going to have greater access to high flow nasal cannula based on where you work. Okay, so how do I make a disposition? For the kid that looks pretty happy but it's tachypnic, my rule of thumb is I always see every single one of those kids at least twice. I don't make my disposition just on the first assessment. I make sure they get suctioned. I make sure their fever gets controlled, that the nurses have taught them how to do suctioning. And then I go back and reassess, because bronchiolitis is like this, right? The exam changes almost every 20 minutes. If they're going home, I make sure they all get the same discharge instructions. I tell them that the peak of the illness is going to be day 5, and I write it down. That's going to be on Tuesday for you. I talk about the fluctuating symptoms. I talk about primary care follow-up if they're less than 3 months especially. I tell them to come back if they ever see apnea or cyanosis, if there's less than 2 wet diapers every 12 hours, or their kid is just not vigorous and interactive. And we develop a suction plan together. Who do I admit? This is where you discuss with the receiving facility. If a person calls me to send me a kid, I tell them you don't have to poke them with an IV. It's okay if you don't do an x-ray. It's okay if you don't do the RSV test. If you think the kid is sick enough and needs high flow and you put them on high flow, send them my way. So start having those conversations now about what facilities want. Who should always get admitted? The kid who has apnea, the toxic appearing child, the kid who is still in significant distress despite your suctioning efforts, has an O2 requirement or needs fluids, or the family simply says, listen, I can't manage this at home, which is totally reasonable. This is what I call my bronchiolitis ready ED checklist that I use with communities. So we go over this with community EDs. We talk about triage policies. We talk about the need to not rush for IVs, but to do reassessment and what tests are needed or not. We really focus on the comfort of the use of things like high flow nasal cannula. And we talk about how they will transfer those kids to us if needed. And then we really talk about the red flags for disposition as well as what we would like. This is a picture here of 2 of the resources in English and Spanish that I think are just simpler handouts explaining this big gray area of bronchiolitis. Okay, let's finish up with the last case. And for once, I'm going to leave some time for questions. So last case, we talked about asthma. We're all going to give steroids within 1 hour, right, for asthma. We're going to standardize this severity assessment. We're going to use Atrovent in the first hour. Bronchiolitis, we're going to take a big collective sigh and then take a deep breath and remind ourselves that these kids will be fine. We're going to make sure we got really pump people comfortable with suctioning. We use standard discharge instructions. We always ask the big red flag questions in the history. And then for the sicker kid, we know that we can use things like high flow nasal cannula or simple nasal cannula if needed. And we know when to use intubation if needed. Well, what about this kid? He's 3 years old, it's 2 a.m., he comes in with a barky cough. This kid has good old croup, right? Presents between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., still every day, and has done so since the beginning of croup, right? Usually between 6 months and 3 years. If it's a kid greater than 6, I start getting a little bit worried. Because although it can happen in older kids, that's when my differential starts to say, did this kid swallow a button battery? Did this kid swallow a magnet? Did this kid have an upper airway infection? So there's some red flags I have. Most kids with croup are barky, they have stridor, they're upset, but they don't have a severe sore throat that they're just drooling. They should be able to range their neck. If they can't move their neck, I start thinking of retropharyngeal abscess, not really peritonsil abscess, but more retropharyngeal abscess, foreign body, button battery. Those are the kids that I'm imaging, okay? But in general, croup management is easy, right? Whether they're having stridor at rest or not, I'm giving dexamethasone. 0.6 mg per kg, single dose, no need for any extra doses, reduces bounce backs to the ER. If they're having stridor at rest, meaning once I calm them down, my golden rule of thumb is the kid still angry even when I leave the room, right? So I calm them down, we control their fever, and then I leave the room and I open the curtains, and then I look at the kid. And if they're still having stridor at rest, that kid probably needs inhaled racemic epinephrine. I rarely image except for some of those red flag cases. Croup, when you send them home, what do we say? This is when I say, the old treatments that at least my mom does actually work really well. They still work. This is an upper airway disease, right? So the things we can do to decrease pain actually allow the child to breathe more comfortably. This includes fever control, sitting in a steam bathroom. If you live someplace where the air is cool, actually going outside and breathing some cool air can sometimes calm them down and cause vasoconstriction, which allows then air to pass easier. And sometimes humidifiers, depending on the type of environment that you live in, may help also. Dex is all you need, and we talked about easy ways to give dexamethasone. And what do they come back for? It's excessive drooling, can't move my neck, or the breathing is getting worse. But classically, I say your kid's gonna have a sore throat. You're gonna see some intermittent coughing, but it should not be as bad as tonight when I saw you. And I remind them it's a short-lived illness. The illness peaks only for about 36 to 48 hours. If it's severe, make sure you have a way to give nebulized racemic epinephrine. Most people max out at about 0.5 mLs. Remember, racemic epinephrine provides immediate relief and then it wears off. So most of us will observe kids after racemic for about 2 hours. Some people admit every kid who gets 2 racemics. Some people wait till the 3rd. There's a lot of variability. There's not a lot of great evidence. Does inhaled budesonide help? This is Pulmicort. The answer is it doesn't add anything. But sometimes I get a call and it says, I cannot get this kid to take any dexamethasone, and I'm not able to give it injectable. Remember, dexamethasone can also be given IM. There is evidence that inhaled Pulmicort, although it's more expensive, a single dose of inhaled Pulmicort is just as effective as oral dexamethasone. Kind of crazy. But we don't usually have that available in the ER, so which is why we still stick with Dex. Some folks may have a protocol for Heliox to avoid intubation. This is often better handled by pediatric respiratory therapists and transport teams because you have to partition out what fraction of oxygen is used also. Okay, that's all respiratory illness. We did asthma, we did bronchiolitis, we did croup, so let's see if we can get these right. So all the following are signs of respiratory distress in children except all right, so close. So we didn't talk about all the words, but inverted breathing is not. So remember we saw the kid with head bobbing, like this. Nasal flaring is a real one. Remember that first kid? If you looked right at the nasal ala, they were going out. Paradoxical, this is my fault, I didn't explain paradoxical breathing is a real term, what's called seesaw breathing. So when you take a deep breath in, everyone take a deep breath in, your diaphragm goes flat, your tummy goes flat. Kids get discoordinated because they're using every muscle body. So instead, when they breathe in, their belly goes out. You can't do that right now, even if you tried. And so it goes like this in this ballooning effect to try to breathe better. Suprasternal retractions is a real type of retractions. That was my fault, but we did get better. Which of the following is true about asthma treatment in children? Oh, so close. Donnie, did you hit the answer? Yeah, I swear, I'm never coming back. All right, I'm not going to get invited just because of this, just so you know. So dexamethasone is as effective as prednisone, and in fact, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's a single dose, right? Steroids given within 60 minutes changes outcomes. Teach every single person you work with this fact, and it will have a greater effect on asthma care than anything else you do. Okay. We got better though. All right, which of the following we should be doing this as part of routine management of bronchiolitis? Don't push the button. It is witchcraft. This whole thing. It's pediatrics. Oh, okay. You know what? I will take that as the 5% that is mad at the AAP recommendations and chose to do that anyway, and I'm not going to get mad at you because but nasal suction should be a routine part of treatment. We did get better. All right. Thank you.
And, everyone gets a trophy, so we'll invite you back.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Iyer. We're going to grab some questions.
Okay.
For croup, I heard that we can do the IV, like the injectable dexamethasone and give it oral. Can you tell us about
So I'm going to give you thank you for saying that. So the question was, can you give the IV formulation of dexamethasone orally? Okay, here's the public answer and then the reality answer. The IV formulation is 4 milligrams per ml. So great. Concentrated, low volume. Even if a kid doesn't like it, who cares? You're squirting a small volume in. It is very commonly used all across America. If you look on the manufacturer's document, it says the IV formulation is not approved for oral use. The only reason that's the case is that no one's really done a big study and gone through all the hoops of getting it approved. So publicly, the answer is, do people do this and is it effective? Yes, it's absolutely effective. If you're going by the letter of the law, technically it is off-label use. That is what is considered. So hopefully that answered your question. Yeah.
All right, a question from a webcast viewer. Does Decadron take longer to work to give within the first 60 minutes?
No. So both dexamethasone and prednisone, if given orally, have clinical effects within about 60 minutes to 90 minutes. And so, which is why we focus in on both. Yep.
All right, then. Well, here?
Can you comment just briefly about Tamiflu usage? It's kind of fallen in favor in our region, and you mentioned that in passing.
Yeah, I didn't add it because it's a big. So here's the long and short of it. The evidence in Tamiflu that is proven is that if you are hospitalized or have a risk for hospitalization, you have asthma, you have congenital heart disease, you have cystic fibrosis, those kids should get Tamiflu and they should get it early. Because the earlier you give it, it prevents the most serious complication for kids, which is ICU admissions and hospital admissions. What about the regular kid? There were some very, very small studies, which had a lot of holes in their research, that said, hey, if you give Tamiflu to the normal kid in the first 24 hours, they don't have as long of a course of illness. That has not been proven when you look at bigger studies. And in fact, the rate of vomiting with Tamiflu is somewhere between about 8 to 10%. So that's the conversation I have with families. I say, look, if they ask me, do I give Tamiflu to my kid? I say, no, I don't. I get them vaccinated. I don't want to deal with the cost. I don't want to deal with the vomiting. I don't see the benefit in terms of getting back to school faster. But I think some families will still ask you for it. So, yep.